I have always believed that the most profound political shifts announce themselves not with thunder, but with a whisper, a quiet reordering of assumptions so gradual that by the time it becomes visible, the transformation is already complete. Every Sunday morning, I watch the headlines scroll across my screen, and I notice something curious. The language of politics has changed. Words like order, sovereignty, and security now carry a weight they did not possess 5 years ago. They resonate in ways that once would have been dismissed as reactionary, even dangerous. And yet here we are, in December 2025, watching Chile, a nation that spent decades defining itself by its rejection of authoritarianism, elect its most right-wing president in 35 years with a landslide so decisive it cannot be explained away as mere protest. José Antonio Kast did not narrowly win. He captured 58% of the vote. This was not a fluke. It was a mandate, which raises a question I find myself returning to again and again. When entire populations, not just in one nation, but across a continent, simultaneously decide that predictability and security matter more than ideology. What does that tell us about where authority is migrating in the 21st century? Most people heard the headline version of Chile's election last Sunday, far-right candidate defeats communist opponent. The narrative was familiar, almost comfortable in its simplicity. Another country swings right amid crime concerns. Another populist promises tough solutions. The media coverage framed it as yet another chapter in Latin America's political pendulum, swinging back after a brief leftward tilt. But very few people, I suspect, grasped what was happening beneath the surface. This was not a typical electoral correction. José Antonio Kast, a man who defended Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship, who campaigned wearing red caps emblazoned with "Make Chile Great Again," who promised to deport over 300,000 people and deploy the military to urban neighborhoods, won by a margin that approaches what we would call a landslide in any democracy. His opponent, Jeanette Chara, was not some radical outlier. She was a former labor minister in the outgoing government representing continuity, and she lost by 17 points. The result is that we are witnessing something that transcends Chile's borders. Across Latin America, from Buenos Aires to Quito to La Paz, voters are choosing a very particular kind of leader, not traditional conservatives, not centrist technocrats, but hardline figures who promise not reform, but restoration. Order over progress, predictability over experimentation. And the speed with which this transformation has occurred, the comprehensiveness of it, suggests we are not observing random fluctuations in voter sentiment. We are observing a structural realignment, one that Washington is quietly celebrating, and that reveals uncomfortable truths about what electorates actually value when institutions falter. For years, Chile appeared to embody a certain kind of political stability that development economists love to showcase. It was Latin America's success story: high growth rates, relatively low corruption, and membership in the OECD, the country that escaped the resource curse. When massive protests erupted in 2019 demanding constitutional reform and greater equality, many observers saw it as evidence of a maturing democracy, one capable of evolving beyond the Pinochet-era framework that had governed since 1990. Gabriel Boric, a 35-year-old former student leader, won the presidency in 2021 with a mandate to rewrite the rules. He promised a new constitution, expanded social welfare, environmental protections, and a reckoning with Chile's neoliberal model. He represented the progressive wave that had swept through the continent. And then, almost immediately, reality intruded. By 2022, Chile's homicide rate had climbed to levels unprecedented in its modern history. From 2010 to 2022, murders increased by 144%. In absolute numbers, the country went from 541 homicides in 2010 to 1,322 in 2022. For a nation that prided itself on being one of the safest in Latin America, This was seismic. But the numbers only tell part of the story. What strikes me most is how the nature of violence changed. Organized crime, particularly transnational groups like Venezuela's Tren de Aragua, began operating with a sophistication Chile had never experienced. In 2024 alone, there were 868 kidnappings, the highest figure in a decade. Nearly 40% were linked to organized crime networks. Prosecutors reported that in Santiago, kidnappings accounted for nearly as many cases as homicides. This was not street crime. This was a systematic criminal enterprise, complete with extortion rackets, migrant smuggling operations, and enforcement killings carried out with military-grade weaponry. The source of this transformation was not mysterious. Chile hosts approximately 1.9 million foreign nationals, representing 9.9% of its total population. 728,000 of these are Venezuelan migrants and refugees, making them 38% of the foreign population. Many arrived through irregular border crossings in the Atacama Desert, undertaking journeys on foot through extreme conditions. The Chilean government, committed to humanitarian principles, provided access to health and education services even for those without legal status. But the unintended consequences were profound. Criminal organizations exploited migration routes. They trafficked people, smuggled drugs, and established networks that Chilean law enforcement, accustomed to low crime rates and limited gang activity, was unprepared to confront. Public perception shifted dramatically. Government statistics from July 2025 showed that nearly 88% of Chileans felt crime had gotten worse over the previous year, despite Chile maintaining one of the lowest murder rates in the region, at roughly 6 per 100,000 people. The disconnect between objective statistics and subjective fear created political space for someone like Kast. Consider the mechanics of how this unfolded. In March 2024, the body of Ronald Ojeda Moreno, a former Venezuelan military officer seeking asylum in Chile, was found cut up and buried in concrete. He had been kidnapped from his Santiago apartment. Chilean authorities later arrested Alfredo José Henriquez Pineda, known as Gordo Alex, a leader of Tren de Aragua, on murder accusations. The case became symbolic. Here was a transnational gang operating with impunity, targeting its own diaspora, and Chilean institutions appeared powerless to prevent it. The economic context reinforced voter anxiety. Despite Chile's position as the world's largest copper producer, controlling 24% of global supply, and its status as the second largest lithium producer with 27% of global production, GDP growth had slowed. The economy expanded by just 0.2% in 2023, recovering to 2.6% in 2024. Real wages were recovering, but slowly. Inflation, though falling from pandemic highs, remained above target. The mining sector, which contributes 13% of GDP and 57% of exports, provided stability, but not prosperity for most Chileans. President Boric's administration attempted to respond. They created specialized prosecutorial units for organized crime. They announced plans to strengthen border controls. They deployed additional police to high-crime neighborhoods. But legislative gridlock, a divided Congress, and the complexity of building institutional capacity meant that visible results lagged behind public demand. Voters felt the government was managing problems rather than solving them. They wanted transformation, not administration. Enter Kast. On his third presidential bid, having lost to Boric in 2021 by 10 points, he recalibrated his message. He softened his most extreme positions, at least rhetorically. He stopped defending Pinochet explicitly. He praised centrist former presidents. He presented himself not as a radical, but as a pragmatist offering common-sense solutions. But his core platform remained uncompromising. Mass deportations creating an ICE-style enforcement agency, military deployment to urban areas, construction of border walls with Peru and Bolivia, complete with 3-meter-deep ditches, maximum security prisons with total isolation for gang leaders, and $6 billion in budget cuts over 18 months. What I find revealing is not that Kast proposed these measures, but that they resonated so powerfully. At his victory rally, supporters wore American flags. They chanted "Pinochet, Pinochet," and waved banners reading "Make Chile Great Again." They were not embarrassed by the comparison to Trump. They embraced it. This was not coded messaging. It was explicit alignment with a political brand that celebrates strongman governance, nationalist economics, and cultural conservatism. Elections, we are told, reflect the will of the people, but they also reveal the condition of institutions. And what Chile's election demonstrates is how quickly trust in institutional problem-solving can evaporate when visible disorder persists. The Chilean state is, by Latin American standards, relatively strong. It has functioning courts, professional police forces, an independent central bank, and fiscal discipline. But strength is measured not in absolute terms, but in the capacity to respond to emergent threats. When organized crime groups that operate across borders, that use encrypted communications, that have access to sophisticated weapons, begin establishing territorial control, institutions built for a different era struggle. Predictability, I have come to understand, is not a permanent condition. It must be earned continuously. Markets reward predictability. Investors seek it. Citizens demand it. When a government cannot provide it, when the experience of daily life includes checking which routes are safe, when businesses pay protection money, when emergency rooms are threatened by gunmen seeking to finish off wounded rivals, the social contract phrase. This is not a moral judgment. It is an institutional reality. Democracies depend on an implicit bargain. Citizens surrender certain freedoms in exchange for security and opportunity. When the security component fails, electorates reconsider the terms. They become willing to accept leaders who promise restoration of order, even if those promises come with authoritarian undertones. Compare Chile's trajectory to Argentina's under Javier Milei, Ecuador's under Daniel Noboa, or El Salvador's under Nayib Bukele. These leaders share certain characteristics. They campaign against establishment politics. They promise immediate, dramatic action. They frame problems in existential terms, but they also benefit from institutional exhaustion, the sense that traditional approaches have been tried and found wanting. Trust erosion operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Citizens lose faith in the government's competence. Investors question policy continuity. Trading partners wonder whether agreements will be honored. The gravitational field that holds complex systems together weakens, and into that vacuum steps someone offering certainty. Kast's message was simple. I will restore order. I will prioritize Chilean citizens. I will not apologize for defending our borders and our streets. The complexity of his actual governing capacity becomes secondary to the psychological relief his certainty provides. This dynamic is playing out across the hemisphere. In Bolivia, Rodrigo Paz ended nearly 2 decades of socialist rule by the Movement for Socialism in October 2025. In Ecuador, Daniel Noboa was easily re-elected with a tough-on-crime platform focused on military crackdowns. In Argentina, Javier Milei not only held onto power, but expanded it, benefiting from a $20 billion U.S. currency swap conditioned on his party's success in midterm elections. The pattern is unmistakable. What emerges is a new form of regional governance, one that values stability over experimentation, security over rights, and national sovereignty over international cooperation. These are not fascist movements in the classical sense. They operate within democratic frameworks, win elections, and respect term limits. But they represent a fundamental skepticism about progressive governance, about the capacity of redistributive policies to coexist with security, about whether inclusive immigration policies can survive political stress. In Washington, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, long a hawk on Latin America, immediately congratulated Kast. His statement was revealing. Under his leadership, we are confident Chile will advance shared priorities to include strengthening public security, ending illegal immigration, and revitalizing our commercial relationship. This was not diplomatic boilerplate. It was an endorsement of Kast's agenda, a signal that the Trump administration views Chile's rightward turn as alignment with American interests. Rubio has spent years cultivating relationships with right-wing leaders across the hemisphere. He praised Nayib Bukele for transforming El Salvador from a nation known for violence into one of the most secure in the hemisphere. He advocated for military strikes on suspected drug boats, deportation deals with authoritarian leaders, and designating criminal groups as terrorist organizations. For Rubio, Kast represents not an aberration, but a model, proof that law and order politics can win decisively. In Buenos Aires, Javier Milei was the first to congratulate Kast on social media, posting, "Freedom is advancing," alongside a map showing South American countries that had recently veered right. For Milei, the moment confirmed his narrative, that libertarian economics and social conservatism represent the future, that 21st century socialism is collapsing under its own contradictions. His government has pursued radical deregulation, slashed public spending, and adopted a confrontational stance toward multilateral institutions. Kast's victory validates that approach. In Chile itself, voters are more complicated. Many who supported Kast express ambivalence. They do not love his nostalgia for Pinochet. They worry about the social costs of his budget cuts. But they prioritize safety. A 54-year-old voter named Carol Mesa told reporters, "He's not who I wanted, but at the end of the day, he's the least bad option." This sentiment, repeated across exit polls and interviews, captures the pragmatism of electorates facing hard choices. Consumers, too, are actors in this story, even if involuntarily. Their daily decisions, where to shop, which routes to take, and whether to go out at night, aggregate into economic data. Retail sectors report scaling back operations in high-crime areas. Businesses invest in private security. The costs of disorder are diffuse but real, and they shape perceptions of government effectiveness more powerfully than any policy white paper. When you think about your own community or workplace, political shifts feel abstract until they touch your life directly. For Chileans, Kast's victory represents both promise and uncertainty. His pledge to slash $6 billion from the budget over 18 months means job cuts. The public sector employs hundreds of thousands. Dismantling ministries, reducing the payroll, these are not bloodless accounting exercises. They represent lost income for families, reduced demand in local economies, and the disruption that comes with institutional restructuring. On the other hand, Kast promises to lower corporate taxes and strip away regulations, arguing this will revive the fast growth of the 1990s when Chile was held up as Latin America's economic model. Mining companies, which account for the majority of foreign direct investment, are optimistic. Chile's copper and lithium reserves position it perfectly for the green energy transition. Expectations of less regulation and market-friendly policies have already buoyed the local stock market and peso. But distributional questions loom. Who benefits from mining expansion? Chile has long struggled with inequality. The combined wealth of its billionaires represents over 16% of GDP. Social mobility is limited. The concentration of wealth that began in colonial hacienda systems persists through control of natural resources. Kast's economic platform does not address these structural issues. It assumes that aggregate growth will lift incomes broadly. History suggests otherwise. Migration policy will have immediate labor market effects. Venezuelans in Chile have higher average education levels than natives 14 years versus 12. They work disproportionately in services and sales, but are underemployed relative to their credentials. Mass deportations would remove workers from sectors facing labor shortages: agriculture, construction, and transportation. Businesses that depend on this labor will face disruptions. Prices for services may rise. The construction of border walls and maximum security prisons, meanwhile, represents significant infrastructure spending. Kast estimates these projects will cost billions. Where that money comes from, given his commitment to budget cuts, remains unclear. The math suggests either deeper cuts elsewhere or broken promises, neither politically sustainable. International trade relationships add another layer. Chile has free trade agreements with the U.S., the EU, and China. It participates in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. These frameworks reduce dependence on any single market. But Kast's nationalist rhetoric and alignment with Trump could complicate relations with Europe and China, which together account for massive shares of Chilean exports. If geopolitical tensions intensify, Chile may face pressure to choose sides, jeopardizing the balanced foreign policy that has served it well. These experiences serve as reminders that economic policies, however abstract they appear in campaign platforms, eventually land in very human terms. A laid-off bureaucrat, a business owner is unable to find workers, a family deported after years of building a life, a mining community facing environmental degradation. The aggregation of these individual stories determines whether Kast's presidency is judged successful or disastrous. Kast's 58% victory is not the cause of Latin America's rightward shift. It is the illustration of it, and if we pay attention, it tells us something crucial about where global authority is migrating in this century. For decades, the assumption has been that democracies trend progressively over time, that younger generations embrace pluralism, that economic development produces liberalization, and that the arc of history bends toward justice. Chile's election, alongside those in Argentina, Ecuador, Bolivia, and potentially Colombia and Peru in the coming cycles, challenges that narrative. It suggests that when populations face acute disorder, they prioritize stability over rights, sovereignty over cooperation, and national identity over cosmopolitan values. This is not a temporary backlash. The structural conditions that produced these outcomes persist. Venezuelan migration continues. Organized crime adapts faster than law enforcement. Economic anxieties about China's dominance, American protectionism, and technological disruption are not resolving. Climate change will intensify resource competition and displacement. The factors driving voters toward hardline leaders are accelerating, not diminishing. What we are witnessing, I believe, is the emergence of a new political equilibrium in Latin America, one where center-left and center-right parties lose ground to figures who reject centrism altogether, where traditional coalition building gives way to majoritarian mandates, where international institutions exercise less influence over domestic policy, where the United States, under Trump and successors, rewards ideological alignment rather than promoting universal democratic values. This equilibrium is unstable. Kast must deliver results. If crime remains high, if deportations prove logistically impossible, if budget cuts trigger social unrest, voters will punish him just as they punished Boric. But even if Kast fails, the template remains. The next candidate will promise similar solutions, perhaps with better execution. The underlying demand for order, for predictability, for restoration, does not disappear with any single election outcome. The broader lesson transcends Chile. Stability wins. Trust wins. Institutions that can demonstrate competence in addressing visible threats win. Ideological commitments, however sincere, matter less than tangible security. This is not cynicism. It is realism, and it explains why, across vastly different contexts, from Santiago to El Salvador to Manila, voters are choosing leaders who promise strength over those who promise justice. The political center, which depends on public faith in incremental reform, cannot hold when disorder persists. In a century where borders are porous, where criminal networks operate transnationally, where economic shocks propagate instantly, and where climate displacement will dwarf current migration flows, which nations will thrive? The answer, I suspect, is not those with the strongest militaries or largest economies. It will be those who can maintain predictable governance amid chaos, those that can adapt institutions without losing legitimacy, those that can balance security with liberty, sovereignty with cooperation, identity with pluralism. Chile's election demonstrates how difficult that balance is to maintain. It shows how quickly electorates abandon progressive experiments when they feel unsafe. And it reminds us that authority flows not to those with the best ideas, but to those who can credibly promise to restore order. If you found this perspective useful, I hope you will stay engaged, think critically about the forces reshaping our hemisphere, and recognize that what happens in Santiago or Buenos Aires or Quito reverberates far beyond their borders. These are not isolated events. They are chapters in a larger story about how democracies respond to stress in the 21st century. Until next time, stay curious and stay attentive to the quiet shifts that reveal where power truly lies.